Alatreon is an elder dragon with a unique ability to use multiple elemental powers. He was the final boss of Monster Hunter Tri, and was later brought back to Iceborne. With his introduction came one of the most controversial additions to not just the game, but the entire series. In this video, we're going to discuss Escaton Judgement, how it affected the fight, the problems people had with it, and how Monster Hunter has handled difficulty as of late. As mentioned earlier, Alatreon is the final boss of Monster Hunter Tri. Fans of the series are largely very fond of this game, as it was the first Monster Hunter for many of them, and introduced a lot of cool changes and concepts to the series. Alatreon has the ability to use 4 of Monster Hunter's 5 elements. On the ground he uses Dragon and Fire, and after a while he will begin attacking with Thunder and Ice from the air, where he'll generally be more tricky to deal with. Monster Hunter World is a significant game in the series, as it completely overhauled the gameplay by giving the player more movement options, but also remaking the monsters from scratch to be faster and have new abilities. Many of them are very different to how they were in the older games, which led to excitement as more and more fan favourites were brought back. Alatreon was initially teased for Iceborne as a returning fan favourite, and people were excited to see how he would be in this game. In Iceborne, he was given 3 elemental states: Fire active, Ice active, and Dragon active, which dictates his primary elements. Alatreon will start in Fire or Ice before changing to Dragon. After Dragon, he will switch to the opposite of the element he started as, and will do so by performing Escaton Judgement.
Alatreon's readying a big attack. Get your healing items ready.
This is a special attack where he discharges a ton of elemental energy, and it's an unblockable, unavoidable, guaranteed kill. It drains your health faster than you can heal, and you will die from it. Potentially. Because it is possible to suppress its power, allowing you to survive by healing through it, and the way this is done is by dealing elemental damage in the 6 or so minutes before he performs the attack. If you hit him enough, he'll get knocked out and the NPCs inform you that he's been suppressed, and when he performs the attack, you'll be able to heal through it. Barely, but you can live. Escaton Judgement caused chaos in the Monster Hunter community. Monster Hunter World was no stranger to one-shot mechanics, but in the past they had all been avoidable. This was the first one that could only be prevented by dealing enough damage, a mechanic commonly known as a DPS check. Because of this, people had trouble beating Alatreon, and this led to blowback like negative review bombs, calls, and even petitions for him to be nerfed. But very quickly this perception shifted, and eventually people became far more positive towards him. Alatreon still has plenty of detractors, but you don't become the 10th most popular monster of all time by also being the most hated. I wanted to take a closer look into the complaints people had for Iceborne Alatreon. When drafting this script, I was under the assumption that people had specific complaints upon release that slowly changed or died down as more and more people came around on him. So I started looking at discussions from the time of release and wrote down many of the arguments I saw. But because Iceborne Alatreon is still a fairly controversial topic, people still talk about him, so you can find plenty of discussions even in recent years, and what I found is that many of the initial arguments have stayed the same, with only one really dying down. Before we proceed, keep in mind that I do not necessarily agree with all these complaints, we'll get to that later. So, let's take a look at why a lot of people don't like Iceborne Alatreon. The first complaint is one that we'll get out of the way very quickly. He's too hard! This was the biggest issue people had with Alatreon upon its release, and definitively the one that's flipped the most since then. The DPS check is impossible to beat. It's unfair that Alatreon can just delete us like that. This is what caused the review bomb, the petition, all the initial outrage. By its nature, the complaints came from people who couldn't beat him, and it was very widely shared when Alatreon released. Over time the consensus flipped, because more and more people were able to beat him. This resulted in the initial complainers looking a little bit silly, and if you call Alatreon too hard nowadays, you get laughed out of the room. It's too hard is not really a good criticism on its own. It's very broad and doesn't really describe anything, but it's worth mentioning because it was the biggest complaint upon release. The thing is, it's still comprised of every issue we'll talk about, so let's get into the more specific issues. Complaint 1. Alatreon forces us to use elemental weapons. Because it's the only way to suppress Escaton Judgement, you need to bring elemental weapons in order to survive the attack. If you go with Roar, Poison, Sleep, or even Blast, you will die. While all weapons can hurt monsters, elemental weapons deal additional fire, water, thunder, ice, or dragon damage with every hit. It only works on monsters that are specifically weak to them. For example, bringing a fire weapon to fight Rathalos will be pointless, as it won't do anything to him. But bringing a dragon or thunder weapon means each of your attacks will deal bonus damage, allowing you to kill him faster. Bringing the right elemental weapon for a monster that is weak to them rewards the hunter for preparing in advance and knowing the monster's weakness, which incentivizes them to craft more of these weapons from many different types of monster. So why were people annoyed that they had to use elemental weapons? Well, there's quite a few reasons, but the biggest, most prominent one is that Element sucks! Elemental weapons in Iceborne are notoriously not very good. Your weapon's damage is dictated by a few things, primarily the motion value of its attacks. The motion value is how the speed of your weapon contributes to attack power. The easiest way to describe it is that a fast attack would have a lower motion value and deal less damage, but a slower attack has a higher motion value, so it will deal much more damage. Striking once with a pair of dual swords does very little damage because of how fast they are. Conversely, a swing of a greatsword would deal much more damage. This makes sense for the playstyles of the weapons. Dual swords have you constantly attacking and weaving around the monster, whereas greatsword has you only attack at specific opportunities, but with massive damage each time. This results in both weapons being effective, despite differences in speed. Elemental damage is bonus attack, but it's not really affected by motion values. If a greatsword and a dual swords pair have the same elemental damage number listed, they will deal the same elemental damage per hit. If a swing from dual swords deals 20 more elemental damage, so would a swing from a slower greatsword. But this means that faster weapons benefit much more from elements than slower ones do, as their attack rate means that elements will considerably buff them. A greatsword or gun lance won't really get the same benefits, so they're much better off going with raw damage. So mains of slower weapons generally didn't bother making a ton of elemental weapons. This meant that only certain players had invested in them when Alatreon had released, and everyone else had to suddenly start grinding so they could actually beat him. So judging by this, the complaint should be, Element sucks, but only on some weapons. No, Element is just not very good in general. Raw has always been the better option. Raw damage generally can be boosted by a wide variety of skills in the game. Attack boost, critical eye, critical boost, weakness exploit are huge examples. The best Iceborne sets have those skills equipped as they massively boost your raw damage, but they do nothing for elements. The only skills that can buff elemental damage are individual damage boost skills for every element, which marginally increases it, or critical element, which allows elemental damage to also increase for critical hits. That's right, elemental damage does not do that by default. It has to be enabled, and in Iceborne, you can only get this skill by equipping Silver Rathalos armor, which drastically limits what kind of sets you can make. There's also Coalescence, which buffs your raw and elemental damage after recovering from an elemental blight or abnormal status, but that's not always ideal. Monsters take different amounts of damage all over their bodies, which are referred to as hit zones. Usually they'll take the most damage on the head, or wings, but elemental hit zones also exist, and unlike the raw hit zones, are not really communicated in game, which means you won't always be dealing good elemental damage when hitting the monster. Truth be told, raw is not only always a better option, but it's a one-size-fits-all for any situation. A fire weapon is only good for monsters weak to fire, but every monster takes the same raw damage, so why not just make a good raw weapon and bring it everywhere? This becomes more apparent with the non-elemental boost skill, which boosts raw damage weapons even further. Unlike the elemental damage boost skills, this one only needs a single decoration for the full effect, and the damage it adds will actually scale with critical hits, which is not the case with elements. There's also the blast status, which is usually the best option in every game it's been in. The way blast works, every attack from your weapon will build up to a massive explosion that deals a flat amount of damage that ignores hit zones completely. It's very powerful, and in Iceborne, blast weapons are especially favoured thanks to Raging Brachydios, who gave every weapon type a pretty good option for them. So the question is, why would anybody want to use elemental weapons when raw, especially with blast, is a significantly better option? Alatreon finally gave an answer: if you don't use them, I will kill you. So you need elemental weapons. The best options at the time were Kolv Taroth and Safi Jiva, who had the potential to drop a wide variety of powerful elemental weapons, keyword being potential. The weapons they would give were often completely random, and to even obtain them you'd have to do these quests multiple times, and they'd be scaled for multiplayer, which not everyone can do, and they're not even always available. It's not great. So elemental weapons suck. People had been using raw and blast the whole time because why wouldn't they? Now they need elemental weapons to actually beat the fights for the first time ever, and the best options for them are time limited grindy raid bosses. Complaint 2. DPS checks do not belong in Monster Hunter. Escaton Judgement is a DPS check, which by definition is a point in the battle where you need to have done enough damage or you face consequences. This is technically part of the "it's too hard" criticism, but it is widely held by people who have no trouble beating Alatreon and still don't like him. By their very nature, DPS checks require you to deal a certain amount of damage, and if the check is hard to overcome, you need to be very aggressive. Being aggressive forces you to take risks, and if you're too reckless, you will end up dying to many of Alatreon's other attacks. Succeeding at Monster Hunter combat generally requires you to strike the monster while not being hit back in response. Taking a hit puts you at risk of dying and requires you to back off and heal, wasting time. The best hunters can hit the monster relentlessly and not get hit back at all. That being said, Monster Hunter is still very forgiving for players that take a lot of hits. Do you know why quests give us 50 minutes to kill a monster? It's generally to ensure that many types of players will be able to beat them. The offensive players, defensive players, those who like gathering, those who want to kill other monsters on the map. It usually requires some skill to beat quests in shorter time frames, but there is little stopping someone who isn't as good from just taking their time. Quests allow 3 total deaths, so even if someone keeps getting hit too much, they still have a few chances to correct their mistakes and play differently. There's generally a lot of space to succeed, so as long as you hit the monster a lot and don't get hit too much, you'll be okay. DPS checks reverse this entirely, because now succeeding comes entirely down to being aggressive in order to avoid catastrophe. You have to do this amount of damage in this amount of time or everyone dies. As said earlier, being too aggressive comes with more risks, as it requires you to really get up in the monster's face, so you have to be ready to dodge anything they throw at you. Part of the I'm not going to keep doing that. Part of the it's too hard outrage had people saying things like, you need to be a speedrunner to beat Alatreon. Most Hunter speedrunners by definition complete quests very quickly, then constantly attacking and evading every single attack the monster can do. From that perspective, Iceborne Alatreon is arguably geared to these kinds of players. Personally, I have a problem with the idea that DPS checks don't belong in Monster Hunter, because even before World there were a fair few. I think the people who say this largely mean something else, a different complaint that's widely shared. Complaint 3. Insta-kills do not belong in Monster Hunter. To reiterate, Escaton Judgement is a guaranteed kill. You cannot avoid, tank, or heal through it. And this complaint to an extent is true. Not a single attack prior to World can instantly guarantee your death like that. This is because if your defense is high enough, you can tank anything, as well as other skills like Feline Moxie or Guts coming into play. But more importantly, there were always generally ways to avoid or play around them. They do not belong in Monster Hunter to such an extent that the first boss to introduce them was Behemoth, who is literally from a different game. Final Fantasy XIV's Behemoth is capable of a devastating attack called Ecliptic Meteor that will one-shot anyone, no matter where you are on the map. The only way to avoid it is to get behind comets you should have summoned earlier. Farcasters are disabled during the attack, so this is the only way you can hide. Slaffy Jiva had a pretty much identical mechanic too, where he'd cause rocks to fall and would later devastate the entire area with the Sapphire of the Emperor. Once again, you had to hide in order to not die. I mentioned Kolv Taroth earlier. She was a siege battle introduced in Monster Hunter World. You had to gradually wear her down over many quests before the real fight began. When she returned for Master Rank, she was fightable through a normal, albeit rotating quest, which garnered criticism. She has 3 phases, and if you do not deal enough damage, she will just leave, ending the fight. This is arguably more devastating than Escaton, because at least that attack still leaves you with a fighting chance. So when Alatreon released after all that, there was a real sense of, oh my god, not another DPS check insta-kill nuke attack. To some people, it felt like the developers were running out of ideas. DPS checks that end the fight upon failure are generally seen as MMO mechanics, so perhaps they made sense for the MMO monster and the MMO-like sieges, but Alatreon was just a standard boss who didn't even have this in the past. Complaint 4. It's artificial difficulty. Now this one's interesting. Many people have different definitions of artificial difficulty, and the complaint is leveraged against Alatreon a lot. Difficulty is how tough it is to surpass, overcome, or beat a challenge. So from a gaming standpoint, I would consider artificial difficulty to be when a game cheats, breaks its own rules, or introduces cheap mechanics to make things harder. One example of artificial difficulty can be seen in Mario Kart games. Sometimes I'll be in first place, well ahead of the competition, but suddenly they'll accelerate to comical speeds in order to catch up with me. This is common in racing games, and is generally referred to as rubber banding. The CPUs are essentially cheating to make things harder for me, since it would not be possible for real players to do that. Escaton Judgement is seen as artificial difficulty by many. It was not in the original fight, and it introduces a new and seemingly unpleasant difficulty for many people. Someone on Reddit attributed his dislike of the fight to invisible timers, which I think helps get the point across, so we'll use that. We touched upon this earlier, but Monster Hunter generally has 50-minute time limits for quests, even Alatreon has one. But Escaton sort of subverts that, because it happens after around 6 minutes. 6 minutes until the fight potentially ends. 6 minutes for you to deal as much elemental damage as you can. This timer is not exactly visible, and it makes the existing timer completely pointless and arguably a bit misleading, because it is impossible for an Alatreon hunt to time out. Another example of artificial difficulty is the fact that Farcasters are disabled. These are used to return back to base camp and can normally be used during combat. The only time they've been disabled are during Behemoth's Ecliptic Meteor and Safi'jiiva's Sapphire of the Emperor, but once those attacks are over, they become available again. With Alatreon, you cannot use them for the entire fight. This means that during an Alatreon hunt, you cannot restock items, you cannot change your weapon, and you cannot change your armor. And for a difficult monster like Alatreon that might prompt you to change strategies if you're having trouble, this is very restrictive. Aside from 2 special instances, no other fight in the game has prevented you from doing these things, and so it feels like a cheap, unnatural way of creating more difficulty. Personally, I think the no Farcaster thing is a far greater example of artificial difficulty than the Escaton stuff, mostly because the term itself is very broad, and I don't think most people use it correctly. But also because there's no real reason why we can't use the Farcaster. It's very arbitrary. Not having access to Farcasters leads to one final complaint I've seen thrown around. Complaint 5. The horns. Something about Iceborne Alatreon that bothers people is the way he switches elements. You're supposed to bring an ice weapon if he starts off in fire active, and a fire weapon if he starts in ice active. The second state he changes to is dragon, and then he Escaton Judgments to the opposite element. In theory, this completely screws you over. If he brought ice weapons for fire, and he later switches to ice, you will be dealing 0 elemental damage. Not having access to Farcasters means you can't switch weapons to the appropriate element. That's where the horns come in. During dragon active, you'll be able to break 1 horn, and doing so will stop him from switching over completely. So if he starts off in fire and switches to dragon, breaking a horn will make him Escaton Judgment back to fire, allowing you to keep dealing ice elemental damage. Now, there's only 2 horns, so if you get to the point where Alatreon does a 3rd Escaton, there will be no more horns to break, and so he'll go to the opposite element. This makes it borderline impossible to suppress a 4th Escaton Judgment. Some argue this is silly, poorly designed, and adds unnecessary complexity to the fight. Now personally, I do not think there is actually much to this specific complaint, for reasons we'll get into later, but it's still worth mentioning. Now that we've covered some of the biggest, most persistent complaints with Iceborne's iteration of Alatreon, I want to take a proper look at the monster with them in mind. Can he stand up to scrutiny? Before we go any further, I feel compelled to explain my own history with Alatreon. I first fought him in 2021, didn't get very far, and decided I'd try again later. Fast forward to 2023, a friend of mine wanted to beat him, so we both fought him together. It took us 3 attempts, but we won. Later on, a different friend wanted to beat Alatreon, and I needed some evolution footage, so I joined them. Except they kept dying, not just because their defense was low, but for another big reason too. So we called for backup, and the friend from earlier joined. After a few more failed attempts, we called up another friend, and eventually beat him. Then for the evolution video, I realised I should probably get some solo footage, so I soloed him. First attempt was a complete success. No deaths. Escaton suppressed, both horns broken. Second attempt went slightly worse. I overestimated myself, made some silly mistakes, and ended up not suppressing the 3rd Escaton, but he died right after that. The 3rd attempt, I wondered if I could beat him with a blast weapon. I couldn't. Granted, I didn't have feline insurance, which probably would have allowed me to win, but whatever. With that aside, let's actually look at Iceborne Alatreon. Elements being mandatory was something that angered a lot of people, because it wasn't very good, and now suddenly the game was expecting us to use it. It led to the initial outrage where people were calling him too hard, or even impossible. But what people soon discovered was that it doesn't take a lot of elemental damage to actually suppress Escaton. The threshold you have to meet is very low, and people found they could even suppress it with low rank weapons. One madman even used snowballs, because that's ice damage and it contributes to the DPS check. 3 other things happened to help contribute to the shift in Alatreon's perception. The first is that Frostfang Barioth released a month later, a variant of Barioth with some very strong ice elemental weapons, perfect for taking down the Alatreon assignment where he starts in fire mode. The second is that people eventually realised that each weapon has an invisible modifier to help them hit the elemental check equally. Dual swords elemental damage counts for less, while greatswords counts for more, which means that despite weapons generally being very unequal in terms of elemental output, nobody should have trouble suppressing Escaton. Finally, people figured out that Alatreon's elemental hit zones are actually not very good, except for on his front arms. If you're targeting his tail, back legs, or even head, you're not actually going to be dealing as much damage as you could. so you need to go for his front arms, as those will take the most elemental damage and generally they're fairly available to hit. Breaking the horns is something that a lot of people have trouble with, since you can only do it within a certain window and it requires you to hit his head, which is easier said than done. Now it might just be me, but the horns don't really take a lot of damage to break either. Even when I removed Part Breaker from my set in exchange for Blight Resistance, I still didn't have much trouble getting rid of them, allowing me to stay with the first element. And if Alatreon was able to fully switch over with the third Eschaton, he was always fairly close to dying, so it never really mattered much. This is why I dismissed the Hornbreak criticism earlier, it just has never been my experience. The Elemental criticism on the other hand has more legitimacy. It is a problem because the game itself doesn't actually give you the necessary information. Nobody knew about the elemental hit zones going in. Most people assumed they could just hit anywhere or go for the head, which isn't really true. Once people figured out the truth and got some Frostfang weapons, they had a much better time, but it was largely thanks to advice from outside of the game. Let's look at Eschaton Judgement itself. One thing that really struck me when fighting Iceborne Alatreon is that his moveset is not that difficult on his own. His attacks are well telegraphed and he doesn't really combo them together. Without Eschaton Judgement, I honestly think it would have taken people at most 2 tries to beat him. I think this was the case for me and my friends. Aside from one of us having low defense and casting to a lot of attacks, what really kept getting us was Eschaton. But not just any Eschaton. We would always suppress it, but the reduced attack would end up killing us. A Mega Potion is not enough to save you. You need a Max Potion or Astera Jerky. But it does so much damage even when suppressed that you need to delay the timing. Do it too early and you die. Wait too long and the damage gets you. You need to learn the right timing and it feels really stupid. We absolutely would have got him first try if it wasn't for this. Eschaton is likely where most people failed Alatreon. The thing about Monster Hunter fights is that every monster has attacks that can give you trouble. Like Nergigante, if you kept dying to his giant dive bomb, you would slowly figure out how to dodge it in the future and from there you would become better at fighting him. Or Magnamalo, it took me a while to figure out how to get around some of his combos. With Eschaton, it's actually quite hard to identify where you went wrong. I didn't do enough damage is the obvious one, but that's not really an error. It's a vague outcome of multiple errors. Translating that into a strategy just ends up as I need to do more damage, which isn't very helpful. Compare that to Nergigante where the strategy would be I need to anticipate his dive bomb, or Velkhana with I need to remember that she stabs 3 times. Eschaton Judgement is a new mechanic in Iceborne, but believe it or not, Alatreon is no stranger to DPS checks. In his first 2 appearances, he had a mechanic where his horns would glow with thunder energy during his grounded fire and dragon phase. After enough time passed, he would enter his flying phase and use his thunder and ice attacks. But if he dealt enough damage to his head while it glowed, he would stagger and the charge would cancel, delaying him from entering flight mode, and breaking both horns would fully prevent him from flying until the end of the fight. This aspect of Alatreon was toned down in his second appearance and was fully removed later. Another notable DPS check was Teostra's Supernova in Monster Hunter 4 Ultimate. Teostra in that game is fast, unpredictable, and hits very hard. When enraged, he gets Blast Light, which makes things more dangerous. But what's even worse is that after 100 seconds of being enraged, he will fly up and unleash a Supernova. It's a short range attack that's quick to initiate, so if you're next to him in the middle of an attack, it's curtains for you. However, dealing enough damage or successfully mounting Teostra will have him fall over, returning him to normal and cancelling the 100-second timer. The thing about Iceborne Alatreon is that Eschaton Judgement is the core of the fight. Teostra is tough because of his attacks and the Supernova was the cherry on top, but as long as someone in the squad had a 100-second timer, everyone would know when it was coming, so even if you fail to do enough damage, it's not a guaranteed death sentence. Or look at old Alatreon, when he enters flight mode, he becomes way more annoying and it's much harder to hit him. The punishment for failing the DPS check is that the fight becomes harder, but the reward for succeeding is that he becomes much less complicated to kill. It's a fun dynamic. In fact, let's look at another one-shot mechanic. Yamatsukami from the 2nd generation is an Elder Dragon that's a giant floating squid. He has a wind tunnel attack that can kill you in a single hit if you don't have guts or moxie. However, there's counterplay. If you position yourself right, you can throw a trank bomb into his gaping mouth, which interrupts and causes him to fall, allowing a free attack opportunity. This does put you in more danger though, and in trying to get footage for a video a couple years ago, I ended up killing myself multiple times, so there's a really nice risk-reward mechanic. Iceborne Alatreon on the other hand is more extreme. Suppressing Eschaton does not feel rewarding, because the punishment is unavoidable. Will you live, or will you die? That's not really an interesting choice to make, or a choice at all for that matter. Failure means death, and if you don't know where exactly you're going wrong, it can potentially feel impossible to overcome him. But as we established earlier, suppressing Escaton doesn't really take a whole lot, and breaking the horns is a fairly trivial task too. That's been proven by numbers, and even observed by myself when I soloed Alatreon. But the thing is, I was very familiar with Alatreon's moveset by then, not just because I'd been fighting the previous versions, but also because of the many attempts with my friends. I had no trouble passing the DPS check because I had more or less, well, I wouldn't say mastered, but I knew the fights by then. And that's the thing, because Alatreon requires you to deal sufficient damage within a specific time frame in order to not die, you have to know him. You have to know the openings, where to dodge, where to counter, what you can and can't get away with doing. There is not as much room for error, and you have to take advantage of every opportunity. Learning a fight isn't just about dodging relentlessly, it's also about striking back. The thing about Monster Hunter fights, or arguably just boss fights in general, is that getting hit has multiple punishments. You get knocked away and have to spend time healing, which also cuts into the time you'd spent dealing damage. And when a fight is entirely dependent on dealing damage, you really have to make every second count. Most fights do not require this, not even on the first attempt. And if you beat a monster first try, you likely won't really have mastered them. You can probably just get away with scraping by for a lot of the harder ones too, since you have plenty of time to beat them and just have to not die 3 times. You won't really get to master them unless you come back to make their weapons and armor. Alatreon, on the other hand, requires a certain level of knowledge and mastery of his fight just to win, and that ends up being a massive difficulty spike. So with all that being said, is Iceborne Alatreon bad? No, I don't think so. He's pretty good. But can the same be said for Escaton Judgement? It's a DPS check that results in an insta-kill, in a fight that didn't previously have one, as a means to get people to start using elemental weapons. And I can understand that. From a development perspective, you have this whole mechanic that's not really getting used, and you want to encourage people to give them a chance. A fairly common praise I've seen given to Alatreon is that he forced people out of their comfort zones. But does it really count as leaving the comfort zone if they go back in immediately afterwards? People didn't rely on Raw and Blast because they were lazy and the weapons were easier to make. They did it because Element is a worse option for literally every fight in the game. Alatreon forces you to use it right at the end, as the second to last monster. Like I said, the question of why should you use elemental weapons over Blast was answered with a resounding because I'll kill you if you don't, which is a terrible answer for a series that historically lets you fight anyone with anything. Escaton is such a gimmick that people immediately went back to using Blast after Alatreon was beaten. So what was the point? Some people defend this by saying, well, Monster Hunter is all about preparation. Alatreon made people prepare. On one hand they're right, the series has always placed a big emphasis on tailoring your gear and item loadout to give you a better chance of taking down monsters. When fighting Rathian, you can bring antidotes or poison resistance to negate the punishment from her backflip tail attack. With Teostra, deodorant or blast resistance stops or prevents the most dangerous parts about him, as with Brachydios. Wind resist helps with Kushala, and tremor resistance helps with Deviljho. There's one key difference when comparing that kind of preparation to Alatreon's. It's all optional! The coolest part about Monster Hunter is that once you're good enough, you don't actually need to prepare for the individual fights. Why bring antidotes if you can just dodge Rathian's tail attacks? Why bring blast resistance if you don't get hit by Brachydios slime? Why bring tremor resistance when you can just dodge through Deviljho's stumps? You still need to learn how to do all this, and a less skilled hunter would still struggle massively, but a good player would be able to get by just fine. And in theory, someone with a high skill level wouldn't even need to bring healing items, which is cool to think about. That's not the case with Alatreon. Firstly because you need to heal through Escaton, which is still so annoying, and secondly because you need elemental weapons to actually kill him. That's not rewarding preparation, that's forcing it. Escaton Judgement itself is yet another one of Iceborne's endgame monster big nuke DPS check attacks, which people were kind of sick of by that period of the game. It's nothing new, and almost makes you feel like the developers were running out of ideas on how to make Alatreon difficult. Especially because again, he would be pretty simple without Escaton. Although that being said, there is a reason why Alatreon is the 10th highest rated monster of all time, and why many people walked away calling him their favourite fight. One of the most satisfying things you can do in these games is learn a monster over many hunts, because after a certain point you know exactly what they're going to do and how to respond to it, which is really fun. I know Generation's Ultimate Nagakuga like the back of my hand because it's something I enjoy hunting, and learning the fights made me love him so much more. I'm also pretty good at fighting Bloodbath Diablos for the same reason. And for better or worse, Escaton Judgement forced people to learn Alatreon for their first clear, so they could maximise their damage and suppress the attack. They had to learn Alatreon's moves, where to dodge, where to counter, when to focus on his horns, and as a result they were eventually able to beat him. Would they have had to do all that if there wasn't a big DPS insta-kill nuke attack? Absolutely not, but they did it to overcome Alatreon, which made him memorable. And if you have the skills to beat him once, you can certainly do it again. As I said earlier, Alatreon's moveset is really well animated and his attacks are amazingly telegraphed. Once you learn him, he is really satisfying. But learning him is not an option. It's mandatory because of Escaton Judgement, which itself kind of just is not a great mechanic. So Alatreon is a good fight in Iceborne, but everything surrounding Escaton Judgement is somewhat poorly thought out. The elemental requirement is an interesting idea, but it forces you to use something that's fundamentally underpowered and isn't particularly well designed. Escaton requires you to really learn the fight, which can lead to a satisfying experience, but it's undeniable that Alatreon would be pretty easy without it, which, when you think about it, does kind of bolster the artificial difficulty allegations. I mostly dismissed the artificial difficulty complaints from earlier because I felt like people were misusing the term and it didn't quite apply here. However, the argument itself is worth some consideration. Because when people say Escaton Judgement introduced artificial difficulty into the fight, they're talking about how it forces us to learn Alatreon more than with any other monster. And from that standpoint, they're essentially arguing to the developers of Iceborne, you introduced Escaton because you could not figure out how to make Alatreon harder in a natural way. But what does a natural way look like? Well, in the context of Monster Hunter, consider how monsters are usually made harder, from high rank to G rank or from a base monster to a subspecies. They're given new attacks or combos, or their speed is increased. Take Rathian, her most iconic attack is a backflip, where her tail poisons hunters, but it can be avoided by moving to the side. That does not work for Pink Rathian, as her backflip now goes in a figure 8. Rathian's old bite was weak, short with a slow range. Pink Rathian spews fire with her bite, massively increasing the range and knocking you away. These changes increase the difficulty of Pink Rathian, but in a way that feels natural and fair. She's a stronger, more capable Rathian, and therefore has new abilities that don't massively change up the fight, but force you to approach it differently. Moveset wise, Iceborne Alatreon is much more advanced than the old version. He has so many more attacks in each different state that really spice up the fight. But as we've discussed, it wouldn't really have been enough to make him feel substantial. People would have fought him once or twice, maybe enough to make his armor, and they would have moved on. Why is this? It's because we're too strong. Earlier, I said that Monster Hunter World massively updated the gameplay to the point each returning monster had to be remade from scratch. What is also the case is that the entire hunter movesets were also redone. While functionally they're the same, with a lot of attacks and general movement translating over, we end up having way more options than before. We can dodge faster than the older games, and backwards too, which didn't used to be possible. In the older games we'd be locked in place when drinking potions, leaving us vulnerable to attack. In World, we can jog while chugging them, making it harder for monsters to interrupt us. There's so many more options for weapons too. Greatsword players had to be careful about their positioning when charging attacks. Now they can just tackle through many of them. Longsword in Monster Hunter 4 was all about positioning, but in Iceborne has 2 different counters that negate a ton of attacks. And finally, there's restocking. In the older games, you could not enter the tent to refill your items. Theoretically, this meant you could run out while on a quest, unless you resorted to gathering, which was not ideal and often not even possible. In World, you can restock as many times as you want. As long as you have a Farcaster, you can just return back to the camp and refill your healing items. Then of course, you have Iceborne's own power creep, where for a while, each new update would provide weapons that kind of invalidated everything before, peaking with Raging Brachydios, where you'd be a fool not to run his weapons. All of this is why World was constantly hit with the too easy allegations, as many felt the gameplay changes did remove a lot of the friction from the series. Alatreon in the older games was difficult, not just because he was powerful, with wide-reaching attacks, but because the hunters were limited in how they could fight him. Iceborne Alatreon is still hard, but he hasn't really scaled with us. It's entirely possible they implemented Escaton because it was the only way to make Alatreon difficult without totally compromising his identity. Disabling Farcasters prevents people from restocking, and forcing them to use Element means they can no longer use the powerful blast weapons they'd been relying on. And when you put things into that perspective, it makes the artificial difficulty allegations much more substantial, even if there's probably a better word for it. So, is this what difficulty is going to be from now on? Oh no, we made the hunter too strong. Time to implement extreme mechanics to negate that as much as possible. That doesn't sound very fun. For the rest of this video, we're going to be discussing other challenging fights that came after Iceborne's Alatreon. How did they create difficulty in games where the hunter is stronger than ever before? Fatalis is the final boss of the very first game. He's a traditional looking black dragon with 2 horns and the ability to breathe fire. He was somewhat underwhelming in the older games, but once again, Iceborne remade him from scratch and completely overhauled the fight. Fatalis comes immediately after Alatreon and Iceborne and arguably requires even greater mastery over the fight. He has so many new attacks, each of them doing massive damage, which already makes him kind of tough. Whenever he reaches certain health thresholds, he unleashes a devastating fire attack that engulfs the whole arena. It's a guaranteed kill, but you are given a lot of time to run safely to a hiding place, and the length of the attack provides a nice opportunity to heal and sharpen. Farcasters are disabled during these attacks, but are available any other time. Once Fatalis is at 50% health, he supercharges his flames. They were already pretty strong, but now they become devastating, and as such, the difficulty of the fights massively increases, especially because most of his attacks involve fire. The only way to return them to normal is to break both of his horns, with the intensity of the flames decreasing after each break, and this is possible from the very start of the fight. So the aim is to focus on his head and break the horns, which is easier said than done. They're very often out of reach as he likes to stand up tall. They do become available during specific attacks, and when he goes down on all fours. So you really have to know the openings to maximize your damage on his head, while dodging, blocking, and countering every single high damaging attack he throws at you. Arguably this is a DPS check, but a very different kind. If you're doing any damage on Fatalis that isn't to his head, you're slowly dooming yourself, because that lowers his health to the point he activates his supercharged flames, and you'll want at least one horn broken by then. But you can't simply wait for his head to be available to attack, because you're also working against a 30-minute quest timer. Yeah, this one is very visible, and it means you can't play defensively against Fatalis. Maybe the term DPS race describes it better. In any case, this means you have to really learn the in and outs of his attacks. This is arguably the biggest test of skill in the entire series, and the initial assignment allows you 5 total deaths before you fail, which I'm pretty sure is a series first. It's interesting to see how they created difficulty with Iceborne Fatalis as opposed to Alatreon. With the Blazing Black Dragon, it's all about the DPS check. His moveset is fairly tricky and you would normally be able to get by playing defensively, but Escaton prevents that by punishing you for not dealing enough damage, elemental specifically, and this forces you to pick a weapon and really learn him as to not play recklessly. With Fatalis, he's difficult in the more traditional sense. With high damaging, wide reaching, and somewhat complex attacks, he ends up being a huge challenge. The horn breaking adds a really interesting dimension to the fight, forcing you to prioritize your target. To be honest, I don't think a single person managed to beat Fatalis first try, not just because of his supercharged flames, but even later into the fight, he starts pulling out even crazier attacks that are harder to deal with. He requires a lot of practice and mastery to overcome, and in theory, it is actually possible to kill him while the supercharged flames are active. While we're at Fatalis, I think it's important to talk about another big reason as to why he and Alatreon are balanced this way. Iceborne had an endgame at launch, where you could hunt in the guiding lands to augment your gear, with Ruin and Gigante unlocking at Master Rank 100. The 5 major title updates came later, and aside from being new content for active players, they were also marketing pushes to get other people into the game. Each of them would release with a huge trailer and presentation, in order to grab the attention of players who perhaps had put the game down after the final boss, or even people who hadn't played it at all. As such, the update content was largely all available shortly after the final boss. A more casual player likely would have put the game down around that point, and someone who buys the game to fight Alatreon would want to reach him as soon as possible. It's the perfect spot in that regard. The thing is, difficulty wise, the title update monsters are sort of balanced for people who are actively grinding the endgame, especially Alatreon and Fatalis, with their high damaging attacks and health pools. To access them, you need to beat Shara Ishvalda, Rujang, Stygian Zinogre, and then repel Starfy Jiva. That's it. So people who haven't done any guiding lands grinding will find them much harder than people who have, as they won't have access to maxed out defense on their armor, or even powerful buffs like lifesteal on weapons. It also means it's possible to encounter Alatreon and Fatalis before not just Ruin and Gigante, but also Silver Rathalos and Brute Tigrex, who are unlocked at Master Rank 70, which is a bit silly and messes with Iceborne's post-game progression. This is another reason why Alatreon and Fatalis are major difficulty spikes. They're essentially balanced for endgame players who are beyond Master Rank 100 and have the ability to heal with every weapon strike. But they're also available very early, so lots of people who fight them, especially nowadays, likely will not have the right gear and won't be ready. It's a very harsh difficulty curve and kind of a contradiction. They're accessed soon after the final boss, so that more casual players can face them, but are designed in such a way that it's unlikely those players will ever be able to beat them. But if you put them after Ruin and Gigante, that locks out a lot of people from fighting them for a very long time, and casual players might not bother. It's certainly a difficult choice to make for the developers, and hopefully one they figure out in the future, as title updates are more or less a series standard. Fatalis is in the same boat as Alatreon, where not a single other monster in the game is as hard as them. They have major difficulty spikes, and are designed to take a lot of effort to beat. This is likely also because, again, the hunters in World are a little bit too strong and their gear is too powerful. I do believe Fatalis' challenge is more balanced. The only real requirement going in is that you have to play at your very best. Granted, he still has his own share of unfairness. His supercharged flames come out of nowhere and basically force you to restart the fight when you go in first try, and sometimes you can get really unlucky with positioning. Regardless, Fatalis is seen as one of the hardest challenges in the Monster Hunter series, and he's interesting if you look at him as a response to the Alatreon criticisms. Before you face Fatalis, you actually have to beat Alatreon, but in a different quest that's separate from the main assignment, and noticeably easier because for some reason it has barely any health. You have to do it for story reasons, but I almost wonder if this quest was added because not enough people beat the first one. In the lead up to Monster Hunter Rise's launch, a demo was released, allowing you to fight Great Izuchi and Mizutsune a while before the game came out. 1 month prior to launch, Rise's flagship Magnamalo was added, and it ended up being more difficult than any fight in the actual game. Magnamalo was fast, and had so many different attacks all with varying ranges. He had combos, mix-ups, pins, and a powered up state that made him even more dangerous, and every attack would deal massive damage. What's more is that we only had 15 minutes to kill him. This was arguably harder than even Iceborne Fatalis. Then the actual game released, and Magnamalo goes down fairly easily, and the credits roll for some reason. So why was he so hard in the demo, yet fairly trivial in the full game? Well, first of all, our gear in the demo was terrible. Our weapons didn't deal a lot of damage, and our armor had really low defense. The only thing we were allowed to choose was our weapon, not our armor, skills, or element. So not only does Magnamalo do an incredible amount of damage to us, we struggle even harder to fight against him with the 15 minutes provided. It's the timers again. We can't be defensive or we time out, and being aggressive comes with its own risks. In the full game, Magnamalo is first encountered in the single player village quests, designed specifically to be easier, so he dies very quickly. And later hub quests have more challenge, but he never matches up to how he was in the demo. This is by design. While Izuchi and Mizutsune were very beatable, Magnamalo in the demo was designed to be nearly impossible, to hype you up for the full game. A lot of Monster Hunter demos do this with the flagship monsters. Like World, Monster Hunter Rise was also hit with the too easy allegations. The game had restocking and the extra movement World introduced, but also had its own fair share of potentially overpowered movement options that somewhat trivialized the game. What was interesting was that many people specifically drew comparisons with demo Magnamalo, asking why couldn't the game be as difficult as him? I found this funny because it's literally a low rank Magnamalo. I bring him up in this video because it's yet another example of how difficulty in the series can be created. Magnamalo has an inherently tough moveset to deal with. Inflate his damage, health, and give people 15 minutes to kill him, and suddenly they struggle as much as they did against Alatreon and Fatalis. Once again, it's a DPS race. Can you stay aggressive without becoming too reckless? Many months after Rise released, I actually came back to the demo to try fighting Magnamalo again, and he wasn't really so hard because I actually knew his moveset by then thanks to all the practice I had in the full game. Upon its release, the demo version was beaten by people who had to master his moveset in order to win. But even though the game ended with some fairly tough fights, not a single one was able to match with the challenge of demo Magnamalo. When Alatreon released, there was a real sense of, is this what difficulty is going to be in Monster Hunter from now on? Among the people who didn't like him. Since the hunters remained fairly strong and mobile, and all the endgame fights at the time had some major insta-kill attacks, this seemed like a legitimate concern. Because of this, I do think it's important to look at how Monster Hunter Rise Sunbreak handles difficulty. This is the very next expansion entry, which means it's going to be fairly difficult. And that means a lot of decisions were made with Iceborne criticism in mind. Like World, the base game was also hit with the too easy allegations, and like Iceborne, the endgame did manage to produce some fairly difficult challenges. The question is, how did they go about it? In Iceborne they used timers, both visible and invisible, as well as a reliance on one-shot DPS check mechanics that forced you to really learn the monsters just to succeed. Sunbreak doubles down on the DPS checks. No, really, a ton of the newer monsters and endgame threats can enter a powered up state where if you don't deal enough damage, they'll launch a devastating attack, similar to Teostra in 4 Ultimate. This even extends to the game's own powered up monster state. Afflicted monsters are being drained by parasitic creatures known as the Curio. During this state, they're massively powered up with extra health, damage, and the ability to inflict Malzeno's blood blight. When they become enraged, they get even stronger and parts of their bodies begin to glow. Dealing enough damage will cause them to explode, dealing massive damage, and if you deal enough total damage to them, they'll fall over and become exhausted for a while. But if you wait long enough, they'll let loose with a massive explosion and return to a neutral state. None of these DPS checks are guaranteed kills, nor do they cover the entire area. They can still be pretty dangerous to deal with, but they're not nearly as dangerous as Iceborne's endgame fights. As a result, they do end up adding a pretty cool dynamic to the fights. If you play extra aggressively, you put yourself at more risk, but get rewarded by a knockdown that lets you deal even more damage. If you can't hit the check, it's not a death sentence as long as you can still get out of the way, but you still have to suffer the consequences as you lose out on a significant breathing window. I can't help but wonder, what would happen if you went back in time to Alatreon's release and told people that every monster in the next game would have DPS checks that would result in a huge supernova? It's amusing to think about. The rest of Sunbreak's endgame threats are dangerous in the traditional ways. They largely have complex movesets with combo strings, follow-ups and pins, as well as the occasional DPS check, but many of them are designed so that you can kind of just turn them back on the monster. This can be seen with Violet Mizutsune's Spirit Bomb, where if you let him charge up enough, he brings it down on you, but if you hit him enough, it falls on him, dealing massive damage. Or Geist Magom's Wall Climb, where you have to use machine guns to bring him down. Fail, and he launches a huge laser nuke attack. Succeed, and he falls down, taking damage and allowing you a free attack opportunity. Or Nawa the All-Mother's infamous ultimate attack, where she first summons several rotating Dragonators that could heavily damage you, before charging up a huge attack similar to Safi'jiiva's Sapphire of the Emperor. But if you get behind the Dragonators and damage her enough, she falls to the ground and you get to damage her further for free. Funnily enough, you dodge her big explosion by standing on top of a rock, rather than behind it, and if it does hit you, it's not actually a guaranteed one-shot if you have enough defense. Sunbreak rarely gets as hard as Iceborne Alatreon and Fatalis, not just because of how these DPS checks are designed, but because its timers are more lenient. There's no invisible ones, and the actual quest timer is almost always 50 minutes. As such, you never need to rush or put yourself in unnecessary danger to beat the clock. You can play as aggressively or defensively as you want, but this also means there's almost never a need to actually master the monsters to the same degree as with the Iceborne Black Dragons. Amatsu is challenging and is Sunbreak's equivalent to Fatalis both in terms of legacy and when he was released in the game's lifecycle. Many of his attacks cover a wide area and do a lot of damage, and later into the fight he gains a lot of different attacks and combos, but there's no DPS checks. He doesn't supercharge himself halfway through the fight. He has transition attacks like Fatalis, but they're mostly for spectacle. Only one of his attacks guarantees a kill, and it's pretty easy to dodge, mostly because it's designed to just look cool, and you have 50 minutes to kill him. So while he's tough, he's not as devastating as Fatalis, and thus doesn't require you to learn him to nearly the same degree. Is he still a great boss? Absolutely, but is he as satisfying to overcome as Fatalis? I wouldn't really say so. Primordial Malzeno is one of the most unique variants in the entire series, being able to use his wings like swords and shields. He's challenging due to his combos and wide-reaching attacks, and he gets stronger and stronger as the fight goes on. This all culminates into his final phase where he transforms, turning black and red, and performing the longest, most elaborate combos of any monster we've ever seen. He even has a DPS check that ends with him unleashing a devastating Nova. Is it a one-hit kill? No. Do we still have 50 minutes to kill him? Yes. Is this bad? Not at all. Again, this is very normal for the series, and Primordial is still a very challenging monster. It's just really interesting to look at in comparison to Iceborne's handling of endgame fights. It's very important to mention that, like with Iceborne, all of Sunbreak's update monsters are unlocked after the final boss. Unlike Iceborne, however, it feels like they're balanced with that fact in mind. They're more challenging than Geist Magom, but generally still beatable, with a lot of effort by someone who just unlocked them. Meanwhile, Iceborne's later update monsters really force people to step up their game. Speaking of Iceborne, do you remember how bad Element was there? Well, it's actually a lot better in Sunbreak, probably the best it's ever been. Elemental numbers are generally higher on all weapons, and attacks were adjusted to deal more elemental damage. Not just that, but Sunbreak has a ton of skills to bolster elemental damage. Critical Element is back as a normal skill, but we also have Charge Master, which bolsters elemental damage on charge attacks, which is great for bow, hammer, and greatsword. Greatsword even has a switch skill called the Surge/Combo, which replaces the greatsword charges. It has you attack much more quickly, which makes elemental greatswords a lot better. Other skills include Dereliction, which constantly drains your health, but gives you a massive attack and elemental boost. There's Elemental Exploit, which increases elemental damage against high hit zone monster parts, which we can actually easily view in monster notes. There's Burst, which increases attack and elemental power the more you attack, and Mail of Hellfire, which can decrease elemental resistance but buff elemental attack power. By beating afflicted monsters, you can augment your weapons with even higher elemental values, causing them to do even more damage. It's a genuine turnaround. Sunbreak is probably the first game where Blast isn't even meta, and it's genuinely so much healthier. The amount of choice is insane. Sunbreak's elemental meta really peaked after Title Update 4, and I have to wonder, if Alatreon was introduced in Sunbreak instead, scaled up slightly to account for the higher elemental output of hunters, would he have been better received initially? Part of the outrage was that he forced people to use elemental weapons, something a lot of people had not bothered with before Alatreon, and largely continued to ignore afterwards. But in a game where there's so many more elemental options for every weapon, I think he would have come across a lot better. Alatreon's armor in Iceborne has a skill called Alatreon Divinity, which raises your weapon's elemental power depending on how much elemental resistance you have in your armor. It ended up being a bit bad, not just because element in the game is bad, but it didn't really give as much of a bonus as you'd hope. Sunbreak's Risen Crimson Glow Valstrax has a similar skill, called Dragon Conversion. This time, all your elemental resistances are set to 0 and then converted to elemental attack. This also stacks with other elemental skills, massively raising damage across the board. It's crazy that they actually made elemental resistance a worthwhile skill to have. Let's talk about Sunbreak's Risen Dragons. These are the hardest monsters in Sunbreak. They're massively enhanced versions of the base Elder Dragons with enhanced damage, new combos, and attacks. And sometime into their fight, they all power up into the Risen state, where they become even stronger. You can knock them out of the state by dealing enough damage, but they'll soon enter back into it. While all the regular title update monsters were unlocked after Master Rank 10, the Risen Dragons can only be accessed after Master Rank 100, with varying unlock requirements. Deep into the endgame, you unlock hazard versions of the Risen Dragons. They have more health, deal more damage, and even have moveset differences, new combos and mix-ups, bigger, and sometimes newer attacks. They're the toughest challenges in the game, and I would argue Hazard Risen Valstrax and Shigoro Magala are more or less on par with Alatreon and Fatalis. They have the most complex movesets out of not only the Risen Dragons, but anyone in the game, and they're designed to gain access to more and more attacks as the fight goes on. They're so relentless in their attacks that making one mistake can really set you back, while also leaving you more vulnerable. So to an extent, you really do have to learn their movesets to win, because they can kill you easily if you keep making mistakes. The first time I fought them was to get footage for the evolution videos, and while Valstrax took me 2 tries to beat, Shigaru's took me 4, and this gets even harder on higher anomaly levels and special investigations. Sunbreak's endgame is designed to slowly progress in difficulty the more you play it, and as such, the Hazard Risen Dragons are fully designed for players who have done a lot of endgame grinding and have upgraded their gear, to such an extent that they can only be accessed deep into the endgame. You need to be at certain anomaly rank levels in order to access them, so they're not just thrown at anyone who's beaten the final boss. In that regard, it is pretty safe to say that Sunbreak handles the difficulty curve much better than Iceborne did. However, there's disadvantages too. Once again, all of Sunbreak's main title update monsters are fought before the Master Rank unlocks, so you beat Amatsu and Primordial Malzeno before facing Wind Serpent Ibushi, which is odd. In fact, these 2 dragons are fully intended to be the final fights of the game's story, and it means there's less narrative weight from beating them so early. This is also the case in Iceborne, but it's disappointing to see them repeat this. I think it's good that the Risen Dragons are all unlocked after 100, as they're pretty difficult to beat. However, it does take quite a while to get there, with the monsters you unlock until then being rather sparse. It's also kind of mad that you fight Shigoro Magala at Master Rank 6, but Risen Shigoro Magala is unlocked at a whopping Master Rank 180. Not just that, the Hazard Risen Dragons also require you to hit Anomaly Rank 220 in order to unlock all of them, which takes so long. On one hand, it means the difficulty curve is nice and steady, but on the other hand, the anomaly grind is not the most interesting thing in the world, and I imagine most hunters gave up before they reached the Hazard Risen Dragons. There's even bigger challenges at Anomaly Rank 300, and I'm not even there on my main profile because the grind is just way too long. If you want to beat the biggest challenge in Iceborne, you need to beat the story, get some good gear, and then just go for Fatalis. If you want to beat the biggest challenge in Sunbreak, you need to be at Master Rank 180 and Anomaly Rank 300, which takes far longer. It can give you the hardest fights in the series, but it takes forever to get there. Hazard Valstrax and Shigaru are difficult without relying on DPS checks that are guaranteed to kill you or restrictive timers. They just have a lot of attacks and perform them really fast. Contrast this with Alatreon, where his moveset isn't really all that complex, but you really have to maximize your attack just to survive, which is still fairly difficult and requires you to learn him. or Fatalis, where you have to learn him to such an extent that you have to master him to beat the clock and break his horns as soon as you can. We have multiple different types of difficulty here, and it's interesting to think about which is the best. Escaton Judgement caused waves among Iceborne players by providing them with a fight unlike anything else in the entire game. Brute forcing Alatreon was not an option. You actually had to learn his moveset in order to deal enough damage to get past the DPS check, and not just any damage, the elemental kind. This annoyed people because they were being forced to use something that was very weak for the entire game right at the very end. Even after people managed to beat Alatreon, many were still not happy with him. A lot of them believed the DPS checks and insta-kill mechanics did not belong in Monster Hunter and were being used as a cheap gimmick to inflate Alatreon's difficulty. To an extent they were right. The first monster with these mechanics is not even from the series, and Alatreon's moveset was on some level quite basic. But that also means Escaton forced people to really master the fight in order to win, since they had to properly learn how to work their way around his attacks in order to maximise their elemental damage, which evidently made for a more memorable experience. Fatalis also took this further. He didn't exactly rely on the traditional MMO one-shots, but he still required you to learn his attacks to maximise and focus your damage in order to win. His restrictive time limits also increased the pressure and once again made for a really memorable fight. These are extreme by Monster Hunter standards, since you can't really brute force them like you would with other monsters in the games. But for the first time, you also have to be really aggressive, and combining these two factors made for very difficult fights that arguably locked out people who relied on more defensive playstyles. That is the crux of Escaton Judgement. That's why people hate it. The next game in the series still created difficulty by forcing people to learn the monster attacks, but aggression was never mandated in the same way. There were still DPS checks, but the punishment for failing them was not too harsh, and there was more of a reward for overcoming them. Sunbreak's difficulty curve was also more natural, which let people adapt better. Its endgame system was also better geared to handling power creep. This was not the case in Iceborne, where there's 2 sudden difficulty spikes that are harder than everyone else in the game by a long shot. However, it is arguable that because of this, Alatreon and Fatalis end up more memorable than most of Sunbreak's endgame challenges. Monster Hunter Wilds will absolutely be hit by the too easy allegations, and maybe they'll be true, so it will be interesting to see how that game handles difficulty. Sunbreak's approach feels like a response to Iceborne, so what will Wilds do to create high level challenges? I suppose we'll have to wait and see. Before we end the video, I would like to state some disclaimers. I said that Alatreon was review bombed on Steam. This happened, but because Steam removes review bombs that are considered silly, we can't actually see what people said about Alatreon there, which is a big shame. We do have proof that it happened, because you can find plenty of positive reviews from that time period that reference the review bomb, but it would have been nice to see some of the negative ones. The position is also gone, although archives of it still exist. This is because the creator got a lot of harassment for it, which isn't right. Some of you might read this video, particularly the second half, as an Iceborne's bad, Sunbreak good type thing. This is not my intention, nor is it really the point I'm trying to make. World and Iceborne were massively experimental entries. Again, they remade everything from scratch, and they had to make several important decisions concerning issues like how title updates are handled, or how they handle certain gameplay aspects. Some of these decisions naturally ended up creating some weird outcomes, but that means they know what to do differently going forward. If Sunbreak ends up being better than Iceborne in some aspects, then it is entirely because of Iceborne. And if Wilds ends up being better than World and Rise, which I hope it is, then it's because of those games. I hope you enjoyed this video. Inshallah, it won't be as controversial as the last Iceborne focused video I did. Remember to like and subscribe, and have a good day.